And tonight, I have a number of guests joining me to talk about all things education. Everything from the effects of student loan debt on people of color to the conflict over critical race theory in public schools. We start first with a look at school boards across the country, which have increasingly turned into GOP proving grounds. We're a little bit over 2 months now into the school year, and the first few weeks have been quite the wild ride. Over the summer, we saw heated debates at school board meetings, mostly from conservatives, about what should and should not be taught in schools. Showing up to a school board meeting with something to say isn't exactly a new advocacy tactic. It dates as far back as the 1920s. But there was something about 2021 that led to a nationwide resurgence of conservative-backed culture wars over issues like mask mandates, vaccine requirements, and transgender rights. Most recently, conservative activists and influencers have been fighting hard to ban the teaching of critical race theory in public schools. Now, we'll get more into CRT with our next guest, but newsflash, people, critical race theory is not something that's actually taught in secondary schools in the first place. This past June, the Florida Board of Education approved a new rule banning critical race theory, but teachers and advocates have fought back. My next guest says that as long as conservatives who are afraid of change use school board meetings to vent their fears, well, we're going to keep seeing a hot mess go down in all these school board meetings. I want to bring in my next guest right now. We have with us professor at SUNY Binghamton, Adam Laats. Welcome so much, Professor Laats. It is good to see you. I would love for you to just start off by talking to us about what in the world the dynamic of school boards is today and how it's looked over time. How did we get here where it's turned into like literally a crazy ruckus fight every time?
Sure. Well, from the archives, it doesn't seem so new. As you mentioned, the fights like this, super similar to this, have gone on for about 100 years now. And I know today's conservatives wouldn't like to hear this, but the people who started it and who really mastered the tactic in the 1920s were the Ku Klux Klan. And it was a different kind of Ku Klux Klan than the one you might think of with bombs and things like that. This was a sort of more popular group, hard as that is to stomach. And they took over school boards. They marched in with their whole thing. They marched into school board meetings across the country. And they demanded to be heard. They demanded that they have, our country, America, respected in the public schools. And they ran slates of candidates across the country and took over school boards, governor's offices, and so on. So the tactics today, shocking as they are, they do have a long history of very similar outbursts.
You know, I'm glad that you brought up how they essentially took over school boards and started running people from office from the bottom up, because that is very much a conservative strategy today. The Republicans use school board seats as legit proving grounds to get people elected that have very extremist viewpoints in communities who might otherwise reject those type of candidates. But when you run for school board, it's like the smallest little race, bottom of the totem pole. Your name gets to go on a ballot, so you start to get a little name recognition, but most of the time people in the community aren't actually paying attention to what you have to say or what you believe in. And it has been, at least through my 20-something years now in politics, I've watched as Republicans, radical right wing of every single issue, whether it be anti-LGBTQ, whether it be white nationalism, you name it, have really been able to infiltrate these school boards to get somebody elected that then can grow in the ranks. So you go from school board to then you go to the city council. And then from city council, you get elected to the state house. And then from the state house, you end up in Congress. And then it's no wonder why we have a whole bunch of crazies in Congress that actually don't get anything done. But there's, the thing that it always shocks me, I guess, about people who get to be on the school board and then the folks who come to the school board to chant and act out is the just ignorance and disinformation and misinformation that you have all around what's supposed to be about education. And, people are there yelling about things that they clearly don't understand what they're even fighting against. And I'm just curious, in all of your research around this, Have you been able to put your finger on exactly what it is that conservatives want from education and from schools? Because from where I sit, it often doesn't seem like they actually want knowledge.
Right. Such a great question. I do think that there is one thing that conservatives are different goals, different dreams, different ideas of what's right and what's proper. But one thing that unites this certain type of conservative that we're seeing now, white, nationalist, maybe Christian, not necessarily Christian, but maybe religious type of conservative, a Trumpish conservative, we might say. One thing that unites them over time and up and down from school board races to governor's races to presidential races is this sense of that they have been ripped off, that they should be in control of America, and that they were unfairly kicked out of control. They were usurped. They had their rightful place on top taken away from them unfairly. So the slogans, even from now, just jump out at you. The election had to have been stolen. And when you go back in time, you see that over and over again. The phrase in the 20s was the 100% Americans, as if they were all of America.
And something has been stolen. The thing that always shocks me, something has been stolen from them, when in fact the very people who claim that they are American stole America from Native American people and slaughtered and killed a whole lot of folks to even get here to be a part of this country and themselves are immigrants. And so, again, back to this idea that so much of the ruckus that goes down, it seems to me, at school board meetings are anti-education. And, you know, in some parts of the country, these debates at this point are really just turning dangerous. You've got school board members who are being threatened, like literally threatened. You've got people getting arrested at these meetings. This outrage now, this pattern of outrage turning into violence. Is this normal? I mean, I care about my kids' education, but man, am I going to bring a gun to the meeting? Probably not.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it depends on how we're going to define normal. You know, is it a regular repeated occurrence? Yes. Is it what you see most times if you go to most school board meetings? Certainly, no. School board meetings famously are blissfully boring and mundane most of the time. But the examples throughout history just jump out at you. The most famous is Kanawha County, West Virginia, the capital, Charleston. In the school board conflicts in the mid 70s, people were shot. School buses were shot, which is the one that always blows my mind. Empty school buses, but still, who would shoot a school bus? The school board building was bombed with a dynamite bomb. Empty elementary school classroom was bombed with a firebomb. So, and if we push into other areas, you see similar things. Anaheim, California, 1962. John Birch activists storming the stage, grabbing the mic, pushing school board members out of the way and demanding to know, demanding to get them admit that they were secretly communists. So is it normal? No, it's not normal. But is it a regular repeated occurrence? Sadly, yes, it is.
Oh my God. Well, in September, the National School Boards Association sent a letter to President Biden asking for federal intervention to stop all the surge in, quote, threats or actual acts of violence involving schools. The Justice Department wrote back and said that they'd have the FBI actually look into some things. But then once Republicans started making a fuss about all this, the School Boards Association walked back its comments. This was ultimately an issue about safety, like everything else in this country, and it was politicized. And I just wonder, you know, what your thoughts are about what this says about the power of conservative radicalization.
Right, and especially the howls of protest against having the president's office, the executive branch, get involved in local school boards is particularly galling. President Reagan did the same thing when those buildings were being bombed. His first Secretary of Education, Terrell Bell, issued a public statement in the 1970s in favor of the protesters, in favor of the side that was doing the bombing. So in terms of this, and this was when he was working for President Ford, but he went on to be Reagan's first Secretary of Education. So this notion that we're seeing a new level of federal intervention in public schools is it's just not true. And then to see that the FBI could be accused of something nefarious for helping local school enforcement, local police enforce laws against threats and violence, it's just a ridiculous tactic, and it really is, like you say, it's a sign of how polarized we are when one side is against the enforcement of law and the other is trying to enforce the law.
And I just want to point out that nothing that we have talked about so far has actually been about education, educating children what is developmentally appropriate and what is important for them to be, healthy contributors to our society. So I wonder, whose responsibility is it to deal with this craziness on the side of the school boards?
Mm-hmm. And this is the ugliness of this kind of brinkmanship, because no one wants worse schools. But over and over historically, for political reasons, people have been willing to endure worse schools for a while. So consider Virginia in 1954-55. Virginia, the politicians in Virginia closed down their public schools rather than integrate racially. And it didn't last. Other white segregationists forced the schools to be back open so that white kids could go to public school. But think about that. I mean, that's the ultimate disruption. Instead of having your kids go to school, this same impulse towards a certain vision of America as ours, as being, for the side of conservative traditional values, they have been willing to close down schools entirely. Not because of a pandemic, not because of global health scares, but because of the danger of white children hanging out with black children in school.
The bigotry and the bias and the racism, it always comes down, to that at the end of the day. Professor Adam Laats, thank you so much for unpacking all of this with me and for sharing some historical context to this that a lot of us didn't even realize how school boards have been weaponized. Appreciate you joining us on Amplified.